Hello, everybody. You're very welcome. I'm Colleen Parsons. I teach in the English department here, and I direct the Global Irish Studies program. And I am going to talk for, thank you, Dan. I'm going to talk for no more than 1 minute. We've all been sort of competing about how short we can keep it so we can get to the actual star of the show. The Emeritus database of Irish emigrant letters and memoirs from North America. And this is, of course, the Kerby Miller collection. And anybody who is here because they've heard of this before will know of an enormous tome of the most helpful work on emigrant letters from the US to Ireland, emigrants and exiles. And so we're delighted to work with the University of Galway, formerly the University College Galway, when this book was published. I don't know, it's changed names so many times. We're delighted to work with the University of Galway. I'm a proud graduate of the University of Galway, and this project has been put together and sponsored by some people who are here and also some people who are not here, whose names I forgot to write down, but I want to thank Brendan Moxivna and Dan Kerry and the library in Galway, and obviously Kerby himself for all of the work on this and putting together, I think, a collection of, did I hear 7,000 letters, entirely searchable. So I think Brendan will give you an idea of what this looks like. It is a very user-friendly website. I spent some time on it last week. It is an incredible resource for historians or of Ireland, but also of the US. And anyone who's curious, and I think I would say, I might be right in saying that it leans more towards the 19th and early 20th century. Would I say that? Yeah. So if this is your area, if this is your area of interest, it's an incredible collection. It's very valuable for researchers, and even for those of us who, like me, are more on the sort of reading and enjoying side of history. I did my degree in history a long time ago, and I can no longer claim to be a historian. I'll get out of the way of the historians here. So today we have a program with, so I'm gonna introduce, or actually just hand over to Brendan Moxivna from University of Galway, professor in the University of Galway, who will introduce the collection, tell us a little bit more about Emeritus. And I'm very delighted to have another proud University of Galway graduate, or UCG graduate, my colleague, Professor Chandra Manning from the history department here in Georgetown, who will give a sort of reflection or thoughts on the collection and on some of the letters in the collection. Chandra is a historian of 19th century America, and will offer, I imagine, that perspective on the collection. And then afterwards, we'll ask Kerby Miller and Daniel Kerry to join us for a conversation moderated by Dan about the collection, about the work, and about what we can garner and draw from this. And it'll include Brendan and Chandra. That's it. I have nothing substantive to say. It's just housekeeping. Please do. There is some snacks and water in the back. I need some water myself, so please do feel to get up and walk around. We should be here till about 3:30, more or less. There will be, I think, open time for questions, Dan. Yeah. Please throw many questions, especially those of you in the back. I'm expecting lots of questions as part of the conversation. So first, thanks to Brendan and to Dan and Kerby for bringing this to us in Galway, and to Chandra for joining us for the conversation as well. And I'll hand over to Brendan.
Firstly, let me say it's a great honor to be here in Georgetown University, which is a very storied role in the history of Irish studies in North America. Faculty members who've been distinguished in criticism, distinguished in history, in the study of Ireland and Irish political and literary culture, past and present. So it's a great honor for Dan and myself at the University of Galway to be here with our honorary professor of history in the University of Galway, Kerby A. Miller, who's in the process of collecting honorary appointments in universities around the place. He's an honorary professor in University of Norfolk News as well. So we're here to introduce you to Emeritus, the Kerby A. Miller collection, which is a project that we've undertaken over the last number of years. Kerby, back in the 1970s, as many of you will know, undertook a PhD that came to be focused upon the experience of the Irish who left Ireland to come to North America, that would ultimately result in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Emigrants and Exiles. And when Kerby was working on that, he wanted to try to understand the experience of ordinary emigrants. And for him, the best way to do this was to attend to their own words, words that he was able to find in letters written by them, words that he was able to find in memoirs that some of them wrote. To find letters, find memoirs, he went round university libraries, he went round archives, collecting such material, transcribing it, which is all over the school, and filing it away to use as he worked on his PhD. But what he also did was he placed notices in Irish newspapers, local Irish newspapers, national Irish newspapers, asking people to share such material with him, which many people did. Kerby's MO, if you like, was to receive the material from people, to transcribe it and to return it to them. And consequently, a lot of that material may no longer exist, but for the transcripts that Kerby Miller made in the 70s and the 80s. By the time he published his Emigrants and Exiles, Kerby reckoned that he had read some 5,000 letters written by Irish emigrants from the late 17th through the mid 20th century. And his career continued after 1985. He continued to collect such material, continued to transcribe, and continued to archive it away. And so we in the University of Galway have been extremely lucky that when Kerby had to find a home for this material, as he was downsizing, that he thought that the University of Galway be an appropriate place for it. The University of Galway, situated in the west of Ireland, is at the heart of a region, heart of a part of Ireland that has, from the middle of the 19th century through until the late 20th century, defined and shaped by the experience of emigration. And when we began a discussion with Kerby and Patricia a number of years ago about the possibility of his materials coming to Galway, what we committed to do was to put that material online, to make an online database that would allow people all around the world to access this material. The first commitment, therefore, was to produce an online database that would give you, if you were interested in Murphys, any letter written by a Murphy, any letter received by a Murphy, or any letter that mentioned Murphys would be something you could find through this database. And this tool will enable researchers, if they're interested in mining, if they're interested in domestic service, to quickly access that material. So Chandra will be talking presently about the utility of it for historians. It's certainly of use for historians. Historians of Ireland, historians of America, historians of migration. But it's also of use to people who are interested in genealogy or family history. You might not find something relating to your own family in this, but in time, by reading through some of this material, you will be able to comprehend what your forebears they were, who immigrated to the United States, what their experience was like. So that was our first commitment, to put Kerby's collection online. But we made a second commitment, and that commitment was to continue the work that Kerby had been doing by continuing to collect, transcribe such material and add it to the database. So to find additional letters, additional correspondence, additional memoirs, and to do what Kerby did over the course of his distinguished career, transcribe them, annotate it where necessary, add it to this database. So we have therefore a two-part project. So the first part, the database, we started to roll that out in March. We expect to have all Kerby's collection fully uploaded by the end of this calendar year. As to the second part, continued collection, we've already started to receive a large volume of material, with people contacting us, offering us material that they have in many instances already scanned, and in some instances published themselves. So I have here a collection that somebody has already published, which is The Three Musketeers from Meanmore. And this is a collection of 30 letters between 1851 and 1875 by a group of brothers and friends from Western Galway. So the difference between now and the 1970s is that there's much more of that type of work being done by amateur historians, family historians, and the like. But one particular item that we received in the last while made a particular impression upon me. And that's a very slim volume, a memoir by William Loughnane, who lives in Liverpool. An Atlantic Passage, Recollections of an Irish Person. I'd like just to read you a very small, short extract from this, because I think it cuts to the chase of what, for me, is the value of the Kerby A collection. So this is a fellow who was born in the 1930s, remembering what it was like to work as a purser on the Cunard line, crossing the Atlantic in the 1950s, 60s, and so on. And he refers to a couple having come aboard ship, Mr. and Mrs. Murphy, who seemed to be just another couple traveling back to Ireland after living and working for over 30 years in New York. They were a quiet, unassuming couple, would not cause any fuss or bother. The third day, however, Mr. Murphy was admitted to the ship's hospital, suffering from the DTs. I wasn't quite sure when Peter, the ship's doctor, told me this. Could he mean TB? I wondered, a familiar illness in Tipperary when I was growing up. Or maybe, from the hushed way he mentioned it, it was some kind of sex problem. I wasn't long in finding out. No, though I was used to seeing plenty of heavy drinking in a country village and indeed on board ship, the DTs were something else again. I was shocked. How could a man get himself into such a state with this lifetime holiday coming up? What would the family think when they got home? What drove a decent type like Mr. Murphy to a condition sorry as this? I must have bored the doctor asking after his patient every day, though maybe he realized that I was upset by the whole affair. I gradually pieced together their story during the week crossing the Atlantic. Mr. and Mrs. Murphy both arrived in America from the west of Ireland. Mr. Murphy worked in construction as a tunneler, hard work, but well paid. Gradually over the years, the couple of beers in the saloon after work had increased to a lot of beers, and a couple of shots of Irish to a bottle a day. Sad story, but not one. And he goes on to describe how Peter, the ship's doctor, looked after him, tended to him, and how they got him across the Atlantic and he had not drunk anymore aboard ship. They docked in Cove, they were put on board the tender and taken to the shore. Peter and I walked back along towards class. You think you'll be all right now, doctor? I asked. He gave me a long, sorrowful look. I'll give him 36 hours before he has problems again, he said. You reckon? You must remember, he said, the emotional impact of seeing family and friends and neighbours for the first time in 30 years. You'll need the booze to be able to cope with it. But why should the booze affect him like that? I persisted. Don't forget, the doctor said. He was born and brought up in a quiet country life. He then emigrated in about 1927 and was pitchforked into the fastest moving city in the world. Sometimes people can't cope with it. So when the Cunard line came back to Cove a few days later on the way back to New York, the landing agent at Cove told him how he had watched Mr. and Mrs. Murphy as they stood on the pier, two wee figures slightly bent. They were still there when the crowd of passengers dispersed. They were waiting to be greeted by friends and relatives, but no one had shown up. Perhaps their friends and relatives had misread the schedule of arriving on the party ship. Perhaps they were too old or too infirm to come down to the pier. Finally, towards dusk, Mr. and Mrs. Murphy picked up their luggage and moved out of view. That image persisted in my mind. There was part of the emigrant saga that got obscured by all the wonderful success stories gathered under the title of the American Dream. Here were history's little people, the nameless millions driven to another country to make a living, and doing all right in their adopted land, but somehow never feeling at peace, always haunted by what they left behind, even when at last they had come home. Okay, so it's a very touching little story. I think for me, that is the real value of the Kerby A Miller collection and this type of material that we hope to gather more of in coming years. That it brings into view not simply the success stories, not simply the Kennedys, not simply the people who did well, not people who achieved an American dream, but people who had very difficult, very hard lives, ordinary working people who coped and adapted as best they could in a very strange and unusual environment. And it's for that, for allowing us to understand the lives of what Mr. Lucknan there calls the little people, the Mr. and Mrs. Murphys. Your great debt of gratitude, my friend. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not really sure how to follow the story of Mr. and Mrs. Murphy. I'm tempted to say, well, that's all you need to know. Let's leave it at that. But I am quite pleased to be here to celebrate this collection with all of you today. As you have heard, the Immigrant Project is an online archive of about 7,000 emigrant letters hosted by what I continue to call UCG, and it has just launched. It's Professor Miller collected these letters over half a century, but their accessibility to the rest of us is a new development. I consider myself actually an early beta reader of this project because when I was doing research for my PhD dissertation, these many years ago, these letters were still in a file cabinet in Columbia, Missouri. And Kerby Miller invited me, well, actually I probably knocked on the door, but he opened the door and invited me in to use his collection for my own research. And some of those letters are in this are now in this project. So I actually see this project as a testament to many things, but one of them is the very great generosity of Kerby Miller to young scholars and to historians in general, sharing a really rich, a lifetime's work of research. I would like to talk about the benefits of the collection for historians in particular. I can mostly talk about US historians, but the collection is obviously of importance for historians of many other places as well. And I'd like to focus on, or I'd like to say something about, I guess, the importance of letters as historical sources, of emigrants' letters as a way of learning about the Irish diaspora, and of Irish migrants' letters as a way of learning about broader themes in Irish as well as North American history, including ones we probably haven't even thought about very much yet. And I think this collection, this database is especially valuable because it blends the new tools of digital history with the very old school approach of close reading of primary sources. And it's in bringing those two things together that I think that this project promises to be such an enduring contribution to the field. So first, I'd like to consider the value of letters as a type of source. And I feel like I kind of don't need to do this now because you just heard about Mr. and Mrs. Murphy. But for me, what drew me to my dissertation project and to that file cabinet in Columbia, Missouri, was the opportunity that letters provide to have insight into the thoughts and the ideas of ordinary people, people who don't leave boxes to the Library of Congress, people whose words aren't covered in the daily press, and yet who do think and who do have ideas and whose thoughts and ideas actually matter for their lives and for the unspooling of history for all of us. And letters offer insight into those mental worlds like few or no other sources really can. It's the first reason why I regard them as such a really valuable source for historians. The second reason is the genre of the letter combines in completely organic, to say it politely, sort of chaotic, to say it more directly, fashion, a sort of pinballing back and forth between massive world events and the quotidian stuff of everyday life. And really that's how most of us live history. We might be living through the COVID pandemic, which is going to go down in history as an enormous global event. And while we're living through that, we're also trying to figure out, why did the dryer eat all the blue socks? Or how on earth are we going to get to the grocery store this week? Those things go back and forth with each other. That is how we live them. But there aren't that many sources who convey history in that kind of granular and 30,000 foot detail at the same time, but letters do. And I think they're really remarkable for that reason. And this one, I wanted to give you a direct example of what I'm talking about from the database. A letter that I was really struck with is written by a woman named Maria Dillon O'Brien. Maria Dillon migrated to the United States from County Leash. She landed in outside of Madison, Wisconsin. Once she got there, she, if I'm interpreting her letter collection correctly, she married a man who had been married before because somehow he had 27 other children who weren't hers. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that that's how. And her father came over and joined them eventually, and she had other siblings there, but also many siblings or relations at least back in County Leash. She's living in Madison, Wisconsin, or outside Madison, Wisconsin in July of 1861, or in the year 1861, when the Civil War breaks out. Now there's a biggie for the books. The US Civil War goes down in all the history books as this big national and in fact global event. But she has a July 1861 letter that I think really encapsulates what I'm talking about when I talk about the interweaving of the everyday and the enormous. In this one letter, she starts off sort of replaying a battle over inheritance going on in Ireland, she's very concerned about. And then she gets into the outbreak of war has happened, and there's a bad harvest, and somebody just got married, and darn it, she needs spectacles. And that is not what we think of when we think of July of 1861. We think about Fort Sumter just happened and Lincoln's meeting with Congress and a Confiscation Act is about to be passed. What's that going to mean? And she's thinking about those things too, but she's also thinking about, darn it, I'm getting older and I can't see. And that's actually how, I think that that's a doorway in to history as people live it, that we really don't get in any other way. So that fluidity between the personal and the geopolitical, between the personally specific and the structurally significant, is something that this collection gives us really a front row seat on from the 1600s to about the 1950s. Now, letters in general do that as sources. What do these particular letters tell us something about? The obvious is they tell us something about migration. They tell us something about the impact on Ireland of all the people who left it behind. They tell us about the impact of migrants on the places that they migrated to. But once again, they do it in ways that get us below the surface level. In the United States, we know most migrants went to northern cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, all the places that have the big green parades. But that's not where everybody went. And enough went to places outside of the big three to make their experiences worth knowing about. This database offers firsthand looks at the experiences of Irish migrants in the places you expect them, like Boston, but also in the places you don't, like Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas, Indiana, Iowa, California, Wisconsin, Kansas, and more, including outside the United States, in Australia, in Canada. There's one in Cuba. There's at least one in Cuba. By including the stuff we expect, but also the stuff that we don't, the database really allows us to get past the generalizations and get past the stereotypes, and once again appreciate the phenomena of migration as something people lived, not just history in all capital letters. I also think that this collection, for me at least, really pushes us past the generalizations and past the stereotypes. Because if you just go monkeying around in it for a bit, like don't look for anything in particular, you'll notice things you didn't expect. So I, for example, was struck by how many of the letters are actually by Protestants who fully think of themselves as Irish. There's not a conflict between those two identities in these letters in the 19th and in the early 20th centuries, which sort of disrupts easy notions of a 1-for-1 ratio between Irish and Catholic in people's identities. I was also just stunned to see a range of opinions towards the British in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. Now there, I thought we'd find some agreement. If people are going to agree on anything, it would be then. But most people don't like them. I'm not trying to be idiosyncratic or anything here. Most people don't like them. But I really was struck by the number of letters that would say things, well, at least they're sending aid. Now, I wouldn't have expected that reaction. I really wouldn't have. And I'm not going to find it in a textbook, but I will find it by mucking around in this database here. I think the database also allows us a deeper qualitative look at some big trends that we do already know about Irish migration. One of the interesting things about Irish immigration to the United States is that Irish immigrants are one of only two groups in the 19th century for which women immigrants outnumbered men. The other, if you're curious, is Syria. Can't explain it, just is. But it is true for Ireland. And if you do a search on letters by women, you will find 597 opportunities to get below the surface of that experience. You can read about Mary Ann Murphy, who migrates to a convent in St. Louis in the 1870s, and who had a very different experience from Mary Nolan, who migrated from Cork to Pennsylvania at the turn of the 20th century. And she also had a very different experience from a woman named Anna, who lived in Brooklyn and was writing to her cousins in Wexford in the depths of depression. So big trend, more women than men. What that really meant, how that was really lived, we have access to in this database in a way that I can't think of a parallel example. But I also, and this will be the last major point, I also want to talk a little bit about how the collection offers qualitative evidence for other topics of interest to historians who might not immediately think, you know where I should look for evidence? Irish immigrants' letters. And I'm going to talk about just two. There's many more, but again, I did a bit of a muck about in the database without looking for anything in particular to see what I would see. And two things that I noticed right away were you could learn an awful lot about military history from this database. There are letters from soldiers who fought in the Mexican-American War, in the Civil War, that's what I do, so they stand out to me, but also in the Spanish-American War, in World War I and World War II. And that second, World War I and World War II is especially valuable because a 1973 fire at the National Archives destroyed many of the records we have of World War I veterans in particular. Letters from them can't recreate the exact same sort of statistical profile we might have if we had all those pension records, but they can tell us about something, about soldiers for whom we'd have known nothing otherwise. We can learn about people who went from Armagh to California, from Derry to Buffalo, from Cove to Milwaukee, and what it meant to each of them to fight in World War I. Now, this is, I have to admit, sort of convenient for me because I am at the moment also helping contribute to this volume on the Irish soldier in history. So I was delighted to see this come out now. It's a great topic. Another sort of topic of interest to historians lately that I was struck by and I wouldn't have thought of until I went mucking around in the database is history of disease, history of medicine, epidemiology. And I was really struck in the 19th century, but well into the 20th century too, I was really struck by how many letters talk about sickness, illness, and disease. Easily overlooked, the kinds of things that if all we're doing is looking for the greatest hits events in history, we might skip over until COVID, we probably would now, but we might skip over the 2 pages on the fever that went through town last week, or we might skip over the, might feel terrible about the individual stories, we should, of people suffering and losing children and all of that. But there is a lot to learn in here about the ever-presence of disease, about the treatment of disease, about ideas about how disease spread or didn't spread in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so the last thing I'll do is, just to make sure you believe me on this point, is just one, nothing notable about it, but one example of this trend was a letter sent on July 28, 1868 by an immigrant to the United States named Edward Letson. He was at Jackson Hospital in New Orleans. He was writing to his parents in County Antrim. He was at the hospital to study medicine. And he wrote, "My stay in New Orleans will be short, for I dread in a certain manner the severity of the epidemics which annually desolate the population of this city." One line. You could skip over that really easily, except you shouldn't, because he wrote that in 1868. Now, New Orleans was subject to yellow fever and cholera epidemics. They were annual events in New Orleans until the Civil War. During Union occupation, they didn't happen. They didn't because of sort of coercive measures put in by occupying forces. But what's notable is 1868 is only 3 years after the end of the war, and the annual epidemics are back. that epidemics, they go away with the Civil War and it gets better. Yeah, but only for a little while. It's 3 years later and they're back. One little line in this letter really opens up that reality in a way I myself was not terribly attuned to until I saw that letter. So the general point here is you don't all need to go home thinking about cholera. That's no fun, yellow fever either. But the collection, I think, can lend insight into so many topics that we might not ever have expected to find there. And that is precisely why it is such a treasure. Of course, it's going to tell us a lot about the Irish diaspora, but it's also going to tell us about things that Kerby Miller wasn't thinking about. I don't think at the time that he collected the letters, that I didn't think of when I went through the letters. But because it is such a rich and living archive, because it does combine the big events with the quotidian details as people lived them, because it does bring these new tools of digital history together with a space for the slow old practice of close reading, the Emeritus project, I think, ensures that all the new eyes that are going to come to it in the coming years will always find important discoveries there. Thank you.
Okay. You gonna come up too?
That's my front rows.
Thank you both very much. So my name is Dan Kerry. I'm also at the University of Galway. I'm a professor of English, but I've been involved with Brendan and with our library and bringing this resource together, partly with the Research Institute. So I'm interested personally in aspects of the history of language and how language is used, but we'll maybe come to that. So I'll ask a few questions of Kerby. We'll have a conversation amongst ourselves. But just before I say that, it's fantastic to get two major historians reflecting on the value of this archive. We know from Kerby's pioneering work before it was in existence as a database, the kinds of things that could be done, but you just open up new vistas as well, which I think are very exciting. So I think the first question to ask Kerby is, how did you get started with this business of collecting letters, and what drove you to this excessive accumulation of things?
Excessive or obsessive? Well, I went to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley. And this was in the 1960s and early 1970s. And Berkeley, the faculty at Berkeley in the history department wasn't anywhere near as radical as legend would have had it. But they did emphasize very, very much what later came to be called history from the bottom up. Trying to understand the actions, the attitudes, the opinions, the motives, and so forth of the sorts of people who normally don't feature or didn't used to feature in history books. So when I developed the idea of trying to study Irish immigrants in the United States, and that's a totally different story, which I told you before, I once was going off in a completely different direction. I was going to write about Cuba. But anyway, I lost my train of thought. So anyway, what I decided to try to do in order to better understand Irish immigrants was to try to get beyond the sources that virtually all historians had used before. They had used Irish American newspapers, for example. They had used the writings that were collected of Irish American politicians, of Irish American bishops and priests and so on and so forth. And I wanted to try to get beyond that. And it seemed to me the best way to do it was to try to pursue sources that had hardly ever been used. And that was Irish immigrant letters, memoirs, diaries, journals, and so forth. So the first thing I did was I sent 1 million letters to archives and libraries all over the United States and Canada to try to discover if they had these materials in their collections. If they did, I tried to scrounge up enough money to either go there or to buy photocopies of them. Then I would get them, transcribe them, and so forth. And then I got a grant to go to Ireland in 1972, and I did the same sort of thing there. I went to the National Library, the Public Record Office, all the various archives that had begun in the previous 10 years or so that had begun to collect Irish immigrant letters. There was a deep-seated bias among many of the historians and archivists, librarians in Ireland against this sort of material. When Arnold Schreier, my predecessor in looking for Irish immigrant letters, when he first went to Ireland in the early 1950s, they dismissed him. They said, "You're a fool. Nobody wants to study these people. We don't even care that they left Ireland. We don't want them." I mean, the attitude towards immigrants was very, very contemptuous. You know, if they come back and they bring money, good. Otherwise, you know. And so many of the archivists and librarians and so forth, the head man at the National Library of Ireland, they had dismissed, my friend's research, Arnold's research. And so he had begun to collect the materials himself. But in the previous 10 years while I went there, 1972, libraries and archives, particularly the Protestant ones in the north, had begun to collect this sort of material. So I was able to find a great stuff. And on the basis of that material that I had seen, all of it already available in hundreds of different archives and libraries, that was the basis of my doctoral dissertation. But I knew I had to go beyond that because the database that I had amassed for my doctoral dissertation was over Protestants from the north of Ireland were overrepresented. Anglicans, members of the Church of Ireland, Protestants from the south of Ireland, people of middle class status were overrepresented. People from the east as well as the north were overrepresented. What I really wanted to try to do, males were overrepresented. So what I really wanted to try to do was organize from working class people who immigrated from the south and the west of Ireland, women who had gone into domestic service, etc. People who had come from maybe not Irish speaking backgrounds, but whose parents or grandparents at least. And so that was when I went to Ireland then in 77, 78 with the postdoctoral fellowship. Worked with the director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's University in Belfast. I worked with Bill Shannon, who was the US ambassador to Ireland at that time. He had written the history of the Irish in America, so he was very interested in this. That was when I began to advertise newspapers, magazines, every conceivable venue, asking people if they would loan me letters, memoirs, whatever they had, so that I have time to photocopy them and make sure that they got the materials back safely and then transcribe them. So that was really when it all started. So, by the time that I revised my doctoral dissertation into the book, Immigrants and Exiles, I studied or read a much bigger database, much more representative. Still not as representative as I would have wished, but because I had done the best I possibly could. So.
This is an extraordinary book, by the way. As I said, I teach English, but this is, calling there, it's a kind of Joycean book in the sense of the enormity of this book and what it does is really astonishing. And the riches here. And it's so much more than letters, but it shows what letters can do in enriching our relationship to Irish history and the immigrant experience. I thought I would just read you a few lines from your conclusion of the book, remind you of how you summarize this 600-page book, 600-page plus book. The central thesis of this book has been that Irish American homesickness, alienation, and nationalism, rooted ultimately in a traditional Irish Catholic worldview, predisposed Irish immigrants to perceive, or at least justify themselves, not as voluntary, ambitious immigrants, but as involuntary, non-responsible exiles, held to leave home by forces beyond individual control, particularly by British and landlord oppression. So do you still agree with your conclusion on the basis of these thousands of letters?
Well, first of all, you have to realize that, as I said before, 1960s and early 1970s, what's happening in the United States when I was in graduate school. You have the mass slaughter of people in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Laos. You have the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, two Kennedys. You have the FBI's COINTEL program, subverting and smashing the Black Panther. At that point in my life, I felt very much an exile myself from American society, from the dominant classes, values, policies, etc. And I still feel that way today, quite frankly. But when I first began reading about in secondary works, when I first began reading about Irish immigrants, the most common theme in all the books that I read, whether it was Bill Shannon's or whether it was Arnold Schreier's or or books that had been written in the early and mid 20th century, was that the Irish were unique immigrants. I'm not saying this is true, but this was the prevailing theme. The Irish immigrants were unique because no matter how well they succeeded, they were afflicted by a deep, pervasive, profound homesickness. More so, this is the argument, more so than other immigrants. And that they advertised themselves, they expressed themselves, they identified themselves as exiles, as people who were in America, at least partly because they and their ancestors had been subject to British imperialism and to forms of capitalist exploitation which were refracted through British imperialism, the imposition of an alien landlord class, the imposition of laws which the Irish themselves were unable to influence or to make, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, coming from my own particular background, my own political sensibilities at that time, that was an extraordinarily appealing idea. Okay. And so when I looked for Irish, and I didn't look just for Irish immigrant letters, I also looked at Irish immigrant songs, Irish immigrant ballads, in which the exile themes are very, very prominent, regardless of whether those songs were written by what you might call professional songwriters or whether they were, more genuine, quote, authentic folk compositions and so on and so forth. So I consciously looked for that, and I looked for explanations of it. Now, I think in a way, for various reasons, which I don't want to get into, but I think I was very, very influenced at that time, more so than I would be now, by what later came to be called the cultural turn. To define cultural rather than socioeconomic explanations for white people. I mean, now I think that's bullshit, frankly. But I mean, I was very, very much influenced that way at the time. And so I did develop this argument, which now I would half accept, that it was their cultural background, even more than the actual realities of landlord tyranny, British oppression, famine, so forth. Their cultural background, their cultural predispositions, their training by the church, the family, et cetera, that predisposed them to regard themselves, when faced with the possibility of emigration, to regard themselves as exiles, as unwilling exiles rather than ambitious, proto-entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. Ironically, in the last, as I told you before, because my wife and I just moved from Missouri to Virginia, all my books, including my own books, have been in storage for 6 months. But because of other research that I'm working on, I needed a copy of my own book. So I had to check it out of the library, the local library. Fortunately, the local library is, clever enough to have a copy. Very good. Probably nobody had ever read it. Anyway, so I've been rereading this. I thought, wow, this isn't bad. But I can see more and more, I could change that a little bit and it would be more like what I believe now.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think everybody does that with their books.
Absolutely.
I mean, 40, 50 years ago, I did the research for and wrote that book.
It has.
Looking back on it, I mean, I'm amazed that there's as much Marxism in Immigrants and Exiles as there is. That I didn't dilute it too much with the cultural, what I call bullshit.
But it has great staying power nonetheless, and all work is reflective of its time, naturally. But I've been kind of trying to understand her in different ways for a moment. I wonder if you could say something a little bit about, Chandra, you commented on as well, the letter as a genre, but I'm interested in writing practice, and maybe you could both comment on that. So, all right, by definition, these are people who committed something to paper, and there are different levels of literacy and spelling competence and so on. But I don't know, is there anything you could say about how it is that people would have the capacity to write letters across these different social spectrums?
Well, letters would have been written across a very long period of time, so we're talking from the late 17th century to half of the 20th. And as Kerby outlined, a lot of the earlier letters, the majority of the earlier letters would come from Protestant side of the house.
Middle class Catholics, Anglicized Catholics, people of peace, a certain amount of, school education that most people in, say, Kerry, West Kerry would not have had in the 1820s or 30s.
So it's coming out of communities, religious communities, class communities, whatever, where there was a higher level of literacy. But what you get then with the famine is an outpouring of people who had a much more elementary level of literacy. And the thing that I have always been very moved by are those letters that begin with "Dear Father and Mother, I hope this letter finds you in the condition that it leaves me in the present." The little mantras that people learn at school are extremely touching. You imagine a little school in the west of Ireland with those children that had been sent to school or arrived at school, all learning a little sentence because it was understood that perhaps the majority of them would be leaving. And if they were in school when they were 5, 6, 7, 8, they could be gone in a decade or 15 years more. And that they were writing home in middle age using the same little sentence learned in Ireland. It just reinforces for me how the society understood the importance of that letter. A letter that would help other people go to America, but a letter that could also help people at home, remittances and so forth.
As I recall, I'm trying to remember my own, what I wrote in 1841, according to the census, 50% of the people in Ireland above age 5 were illiterate. And among women, it would have been 60 or 70%. Because it's not until the end of the 19th century that women begin to equal and surpass in literacy. And even in 1840 or 1841, say 50% of the entire population above age 5 were illiterate. And among Catholics, it would have been 60% at least. You would have had, and among Anglicans, it would have been, the illiteracy would have been high. If you want stratospheric literacy rates, probably the highest literacy rate in the world would have been among Irish Quakers. And then next maybe would have been Irish Presbyterians.
It demonstrates that the kind of nuance that we can bring to these sources, and not to treat them naively in that sense. I mean, they survive. How can we explain their survival? They obviously mattered to families. They kept them, they held on to them. They were personal records. They spoke to some experience, but not everything survives. Not everybody would have the capacity to commit something to paper so that it could survive.
But remember, I don't know if this is, I'm not, believe it or not, an immigration historian. I can't speak authoritatively about Italian or Jewish or Polish immigration. Okay? But Irish immigration from at least like the 1820s onwards was unusually dependent on remittances.
Okay.
And so young men and women who were sent off to America by their parents, it was instilled in them, it was probably beaten into them, you have got to send money. And of course you send money usually in letters. money so that your younger siblings can emigrate, money so that we can pay the rent, money so that we don't starve, and so on and so forth. So one reason for the generation of all these billions of letters was the obligation to remit money.
You know,
I mean, a lot of the letters, you go into the late 19th century, like you were talking about women's letters. You remember the Lough letters? Lough, L-O-U-G-H, from Queens County. Anyway, most of the letters, dear mother, how are you? Here is £5. Merry Christmas, your loving daughter, Julia. That's it. That is literally it. I'm not joking. Yeah.
well, there's a letter from Galway that Brenda and I were doing a local radio program on. I'm going to check out the Galway letters, and there weren't not that many, interestingly enough. But there was one from a guy called George Crosby. This is March 1848. He's writing to his mother in Cockwell, outside of Galway City.
He's writing from Boston.
Yeah.
I remember that.
He says, any person that writes to you and don't send you money, never write to them. And he encloses £6 in the letter, which is obviously £6 sterling. So, and he says, as the banker in Loughrea, he'll cash it for you. So these are very practical instruments in that sense. And as you say, and sometimes the responses are, you know, you really got us out of a jam, like, but for the money you sent, we don't know where we would be.
Yeah, but Dan, you do get resentment creeping into them as well. I'm thinking of those McGee letters from Northwestern Eagle, brothers from Northwestern Eagle who went to Leadville, and one brother went out and other brothers followed to work in mining. One of them writes home saying, you never applied to Johnny for having sent home however much it was. You must understand he didn't find that money at the foot of the tree. He had to work for that.
Yeah.
And over years, you could speak much more eloquently about it, but over years in runs of correspondence, this does become tiring. They're sending money home to people that we last saw 20 years earlier.
Remember that quotation from the, I can't remember if it was Father McFadden.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. There was something I was just reading in my own book the other day that I'd forgotten about you. A priest in Donegal, Brendan's County. I think he was testifying to the folklore commission. And he said, well, you know, the story is, or the legend is that all our boys and girls were loyal and dutiful and they all sent money home. He said, it's not true. We hear of maybe 2 or 3 out of 10, the rest of them we never hear of.
Kerby also tells a very good anecdote about somebody having sent home photographs of their children, and the father writes back to America, thanks for the photographs of your kids, but the pictures we really wanted to see were those of Abraham Lincoln. So there were different expectations on all sides.
Can I ask you, Chandra, I want to ask you about some of, and the richness of this material really it's hard to express. And as you say, like even a random search term of any kind will produce wonderful results in there. You just find yourself reading them and going to the next letter and the next letter compulsively. It was my experience in encountering it. But as you say, there's this interesting mixture of the quotidian and often large events, and sometimes you can achieve them by putting in search terms. I was interested just in responses to the Civil War, for example, and there are some interesting letters. There's one I might just quote briefly. This is somebody who was in 1861. So there's Morris Sexton. He's writing from Boston in November 1861 to his brothers and sisters in County Cork. So this is 7 months after the start of the Civil War. And he says, this country is undergoing the horrors of war. I'm sorry to say that it has made many a widow and orphan to deplore the loss of their fond parent and affectionate husband, and yet there is no prospect of peace. There's some talk about pressing men here very soon if the war continued. I don't know what to say about this any more than we must go if we are called out. I have no great taste for soldiering now at this hour at the end of my life, but we got to go if we are called for. And so you said you're going to be writing on military history. So what sort of things will you be looking for? I mean, is Irish regiments and so forth, or service in the Civil War, or it's perhaps a broader landscape that you're looking at?
My chapter is just the U.S. Civil War. The project is way bigger than me. It starts in the 1600s and it goes through the War on Terror. So, so many people other than me will benefit from this collection. But in I have not gone to, I have not yet used this collection to do that work. But in doing that, but I'm interested to, because in doing that work, one of the things that I have noticed in other places, not the letters here, but other letters certainly in pension applications, believe it or not, the pension applications are a big source that I have used. And one thing I've really noticed is sort of an anxiety among famine era migrants for about 2 decades after that, at a time when in both Ireland and the United States, what made a man was the ability to own a home and support a family, and to do that without working for somebody else. And so when the famine migrants come, first places that they go, many of them, are into factory jobs that before they got there had not been men's jobs at all. They had been women's work, girls in particular. The first textile mill workers are not men, that's girls' work. You know, teenage girls before they get married. And that's where the first, waves of Irishmen go. And there is, in pension records at least, there is this very great insistence on the importance of soldiering because it showed that I was a man. And I haven't gone to this database to see if I hear it echoed there or not, but that's actually one of the things that I'm quite interested in. And the pension records are a very different type of source. But they're reminiscent of the letters that come with remittances, in that they are a very practical, material-driven source in which you will find unexpected sort of narrative and even qualitative evidence. And this is particularly important for groups that don't have a lot of paper documentation, and that's true for Black soldiers. It's also true for immigrant soldiers, because you have to demonstrate to the pension officer that you are who you say you are. You don't have a paper to prove it. You bring people who know you and they testify on your behalf. So one thing I'm looking forward to doing but haven't done yet is to read those pension records with this source. There's the other piece that those things have in common is you were talking about letter writing practice. Another piece of it is that sometimes a letter is an individual thing or a one family to another thing, but often it's communal. Often there are two people around who know how to write, and so everybody goes to these two people to do the writing for them. And so the voice is the person from whom the letter is written, but it's also refracted through this other person in the community. And so some of the sameness is because we learned these lines back in national school, but some of the sameness is also because it's the same guy who is doing the writing. And so that's another thing that I know that I think that this collection really strikes me anew with, is how a letter was a personal thing, but often also a communal thing.
I think that's a very important point.
Yeah, I think the communal aspect of it is very clear, the way the letters were read or read within the family, that other neighbours, whatever, would come in to read them. You get it in like Udaria memory talks about letters being read aloud in the mid to late 19th century, and that continued into the mid 20th. And you see it in some of them, the little coded phrase as a way of saying, don't send Johnny if he's drinking, little things like that. So yeah, the letter's private, but the letter is intensely communal too. That the community, if they saw an American letter arriving at a house, would know that there could be news relating to people that they knew in America through the letter. So,
yeah, I've been struck by that too. Even in my look at it, it is calling out to the community in different ways, and remember me so and so, and conveying what news can, and also reporting on the community there in the city that they've arrived in, usually in urban environments, to say, yeah, this is what's going on. It would be of interest to so and so. And sometimes glimpses of wider friendship networks and so on that are tantalizing, because presumably we're hard to get to the bottom of. So, there's so many sort of areas to think about in this context, but one we haven't, I think, well, we have sort of touched on it, but not more fully, is the question of religion and confessional difference, and how the collection speaks to that. So you talked about the rich archives, particularly in the north of Ireland, with the Presbyterian background, but could you say something more about the kind of religious dimension, or even how people reflect on their religious outlook, if we can put it that way?
Ooh, it's a broad question.
You can decline.
I don't, being very non-religious myself, it's difficult for me to relate to something. I don't know. I mean, I think probably far more than I, care to notice. I think that religions, themes do run through an awful lot of the. And what I tried to do at one point in my career, and one point in writing Emeritus and Exiles, was I tried to distinguish among how people from different religious backgrounds would respond to different situations, particularly to the situation of emigration, whether they would interpret this as an opportunity or as an obligation or as a position. I was conscious at the time that there were also class differences, but I think I tended too much at that time to homogenize middle class status and Protestant background. I think I was aware that there were middle class Catholics. Yes, I was, and that they had far more, what you might call proto-capitalist attitudes towards emigration and towards other things than did people from small farm or laboring backgrounds. But I think it's a very complex thing, and whether I succeeded in unraveling it all, probably not. But it struck me towards the end of writing that it was the people in the middle of Irish Catholic society. In other words, the children of middling and small farmers came from straitened but not desperately impoverished backgrounds. Who were most likely to regard themselves as having been expelled from relatively comfortable domestic situations, and who did feel like exiles, and who naturally, because of the political and cultural, if you will, heritage in which they'd grown up, rather than blame their parents, it was easier to blame the landlord, even if maybe the landlord was not a bastard. Or it was easier to blame, tradition of British oppression, which was real, but may not have been actively operating in a particular instance. Whereas, for people who were of solid entrepreneurial middle class background, their attitude towards American society, the opportunities they might find there, et cetera, were very different until they came to the United States and realized, oh my God, I thought I was ready for this level of competition, and I'm not. I've come across that an awful lot. Yeah. But then at the other end were the people from the landless labor backgrounds. Yeah. I mean, these people knew they couldn't stay in Ireland. They knew their employer was a bastard. They knew that there were, very definite economic reasons why they had to get out, and they couldn't possibly be worse off. I mean, they said it in their letters. Yeah. So as one of the letters I remember all too well was this letter of this man. He said, rather than go back to Ireland and work for a farmer again, I would cut off my right hand. The degree of class hatred, animosity, feelings of exploitation, and so forth were that bitter. But you do find that among the laborers. Women may be a different story altogether, which again is refracted through issues of religion, class, region, so on. Historians of Irish women have argued, whether correctly or not, that Irish women regarded immigration much more favorably and did, and that they generally succeeded to a much greater degree, or were at least more content. I don't know. I've seen awful lots of desperately homesick letters written by, Irish domestic servants, people like that. So I'm not sure.
I don't know if I had a chance to, explore this collection, but an awful lot of people who grew up in rural circumstances and find themselves in very urban situations, that is there a way of characterizing that dislocating experience?
I thought that lockdown first sort of leadership got it brilliantly. You know, that little conversation speaks volumes. We do think about the American dream. It was success.
I want to rewrite my entire book based on that.
But there was success, but there was so much. Like most people remained ordinary working people.
Have you ever read Liam Mellis's letters back to Ireland, based on his experience in the United States? They're stunning and they're powerful. I mean, he says, coming to the United States was a disaster for the Irish people.
Who was that, sorry?
It means economically,
Liam
socially,
Mellows.
culturally, spiritually.
Mellows.
Now he's trying to raise money. He's trying to convince, Tammany Hall politicians that they should care more about the Easter Rising and about the struggle for Ireland's freedom than they care about, their next crooked deal. Whatever that they're trying to, that they're trying to pull off. But I mean, those are the sorts of people he's dealing with. I don't think he's dealing with, James Cannon, the Irish American Trotsky as labor leaders, called labor fakers. He's dealing with the people, the upper middle class who have made it second, third, and it's not dealing with the of Irish society. They don't have much to do.
Just in terms of immigration, I am 54. And at that age, you refer to me as the grey-haired man. We'll have a cup of coffee this morning. So I'm 54. They call that middle age. But like, immigration was a fact of life in the 1970s. People, my generation, people born in the late 1960s, that it was from the late 1960s that there was free second level education, that a child born in the year I was born, that was the first time that a working class kid could have been reared with the prospect that you could actually, it was a real prospect, the kid could go through the entire education system. When those kids started to come out of school in the middle of the 1980s, it was a period of mass migration. So there was mass migration in the middle of the 1980s. And that continued into the early 1990s. Immigration fell off then with the Celtic Tiger. There was a little bit of a spasm when a previous government crashed the economy. So there's a little bit of spasm of immigration. It didn't come to the United States particularly, but it went to Canada, it went to Australia. And so immigration has been with us an awful long time. And immigration in the future, it seems, will be different for us. We think, we hope, that people who emigrate will be emigrating more out of a choice for career advancement or so forth. But
the world we're going towards?
Well, sure, we can come to that. But it has been with us a long time. And I think I would say my grandfather was one of the family, I think was 10. And I think it was all but 3 of them emigrated. I forget the exact figures, but something like that. And that, they're shocking figures when you contemplate figures of people born in the late 19th century. And they're, of those who remain then, their children emigrating in the 50s in massive numbers too.
You commented on this before, but it's not unusual to see in Irish graveyards an indication of.
Yeah, I think that's very sad. I've always thought that very sad. If you go through many graveyards in the west of Ireland, you'll see a list.
Just in the west, we went to Patricia's graveyard just a few months ago, and it's all there.
Yeah, you see in graveyards across Ireland, gravestones listing all the siblings of the family and indicating where they died. So you have America, England, Scotland, Australia, and it can be a family again of 10 where all but 2 or 3 remained at home in Ireland. It's very plaintive to think that here you have a gathering in death, but not a physical gathering of people who in many instances never met in life.
Because of the age difference between.
the age difference, yeah.
No, it's very striking. Yeah.
And that went on, into my time.
I would actually be interested to see if the ongoing collection project does start to get letters from the 1980s onward, because that migration is qualitatively different in a couple of ways. One is the education level, but the other is the availability of back and forth.
Travel back and forth.
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
But there were some of those people who couldn't do that because they were
Visas.
illegal.
No, absolutely.
But yeah.
I am highly aware of that because I'm currently working with nun who spent her career working with those people to write her memoirs. But the phenomenon of what Carol calls the Irish transatlantic, if the person couldn't go back and forth, the mental world at least was one that contained both sides of the Atlantic and not just one. And that seems to me different from the exile, because the exile suggests it's one world or the other, and when you leave, what it is one, and that's a different map than a world that contains both, even if you can't get there. So that's one of the things I did look at, is how many letters are from the 1980s, and unsurprisingly not that many yet. But that's one of the exciting things about the ongoing nature of the collecting the project is, I think it will be fascinating to see how those look.
Yeah,
later.
and let me reiterate, not all the Kerby material has been uploaded yet, so there's more to come, but you're correct. People who left in the 1980s, 1990s even, it would be very interesting to see what they wrote of, and to the extent that they wrote. So yes, that is material that is important for us to try to seek out. But we are particularly interested in I'm not going to say there's an acute in your collection, but we're particularly interested in getting material from the west of Ireland, and we're particularly interested in getting material that may have been written in Irish, that had been written in Irish. And Kerby's collection includes some material written in Irish in the 18th century, early 19th century. The latter half of the 19th century. We recently received some letters written in 1909 from Woodbury, Pennsylvania, by a guy who ran a liquor store. And that type of material is of interest. But if you were to leap forward to the 1980s, 1990s, letters written by people in the gay community would be very interesting to find. Letters at all stages by people who could not return, for the very reasons that you pointed out, due to not having a visa or so forth. We'll be able to get a hold of those, and what was the response in letters to the visa lotteries, like be interesting.
It's time for questions, or if you would like to contribute. I see your hand already. Thank you very much. Please.
Okay, so I'm actually a Russian historian, and so but my family is Irish. I'm 93% according to Ancestry. And so I think coming from both of those directions, what I would say is the value of this collection for people who are interested in their family history is precisely because there was so much silence on why did you leave? Why did you come here? All of these sorts of basic fundamental questions. And I'm already third generation. And even my grandparents, they just simply not talk about any of this. And so to find a letter in your collection already that explained how the migration process worked, literally by sending money and then buying the ticket in Liverpool, picking up the ticket in Liverpool. And you had to get to Liverpool on your own. That's not my deal. All of that
Didn't work that way. You got your ticket locally.
Okay.
Every town, every village had ticket brokers. And so if the ticket itself was not sent to you from America, which about 50% of the time it was, you took the money that was sent to you and you went to your local ticket broker, who was often the local people. And that ticket would send you from Go beyond to Dublin, to Liverpool, or to Queenstown, Cove, whatever. So you, maybe in the very early 19th century, would you have to make it to yourself to Liverpool and then buy a ticket there? Do you think? I can't
You
remember.
could sail from Derry and ticket from Derry.
You
the-
said
the
Derry,
big-
yeah,
the
you
big
could, but I mean,
agents.
so many did go to Liverpool.
Yeah, sure.
But what I can't remember off the top of my head is when did people start buying the tickets in Ireland that would take them all the way, whether they went via Liverpool or Queenstown or Derry?
They've been doing that in the early 19th century.
Yeah. So that's all I was just gonna say. I mean, Liverpool was very scary. I mean, a
Yes.
lot of immigrants wrote about the dangers of Liverpool.
And even there. Anyway, I just think that that's the great part about this, and it would be wonderful if you could somehow connect this project up to the American databases for genetic research, or not genetic research, but family history, like Ancestry and 23andMe, at least to let them know that this exists
Yeah.
for the ones who are super curious about finding out more.
Okay, yeah.
John, your hand, I see your hand.
Yeah, I have two related questions. One is, do you get any sense when you go through these missives, whether the cost of postage, was it all a factor in how often people wrote, and along with that, is there much indication in these letters that there was material that was sent across as well? And I would think that would affect the cost of postage, clothing, for example, or things of that nature. Thank you.
But there's a big difference, there's a big change in about the middle of the 19th century. I can't remember the exact year, maybe 1870, when the penny post comes in. And the post office, the American post office system is radically reformed. The cost of sending very small letters on very thin paper weighs very little. That cost is dropped radically. Earlier in the late 18th and early 19th century, you get the impression sometimes that 50% or far more of the letters that were sent never reached their destinations. And so people would write huge letters on very heavy paper. Sometimes they would turn the letters and write crosswise in order to get the maximum number of words on each page. And as my wife can tell you, those are unbelievably difficult to read because she helped me transcribe a number of them. But at some point around the middle of the 19th century, postage became much cheaper. More people were writing. The letters were shorter. And it became a much more common, much more natural thing for people to write letters. Does that cover what your first question? Or did I leave out
Yeah,
something?
yeah, it does. Thank you.
Oh, and
I
your
guess
second question, I'm sorry.
The material, other things sent
Oh.
with the correspondence, yeah.
Well, in the late 19th, early 20th century, yeah, they're sending clothes, not in the same letters, but they're sending packages and they're sending, photographs. Lots and lots of photographs. Even in the 1870s, because I just finished transcribing this journal written by an immigrant from Kilkenny that spans from like 1867 to 1882. And he's talking about getting photographs taken and sending them with his relatives in Ireland, get their photographs taken and send them to him and so on and so forth. So photographs and then later clothes and so on and so forth. There's a wonderful collection of material in what used to be called the Irish Folklore Commission. It's now called the Department of Irish Folklore in University College Dublin. And there's an enormous amount of wonderful material. Unfortunately for me, most of it's in Irish and I can't read Irish, but an awful lot of it's still in English, where they sent folklore collectors from the 1930s onwards. They sent folklore collectors out into the countryside, and the people would describe their own immigration if they were returned immigrants, or they would describe emigration by their families. They would describe the impact of immigration on their villages, and so on and so forth. And clothes and photographs coming from the United States made an enormous impact. I mean, the phrase was, my God, is that our daughter? She never looked like that when she was wearing our clothes, our clothes, but suddenly now she looks glamorous and stylish, totally different because she's wearing American, American clothes bought in a department store. She may be a domestic servant, but she has enough money to dress vastly more stylishly than the people at home. And this helps or causes the people at home to feel very inferior about themselves. And it causes their children to want to emigrate so they can be just like Bridget, or just like Mary, and so on and so forth. So they can send photographs at home looking so glamorous and stylish, So America becomes a kind of romantic place in the eyes of many of these people.
A few more hands. I thought you first, please.
How do you anticipate the collection continuing on into the present with people relying on digital communication more? I mean, emails seem pretty straightforward, but like text messages being very fragmentary, and then the cost of telephone calls being dramatically reduced to things like WhatsApp and FaceTime. So people would, for a long story, may turn to a call versus writing in a letter.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, I can tell you, in my collection, there are thousands of emails, but those are emails that I sent out and that I received concerning the research that I was doing about the immigrants. But I'm probably one of the very few people who actually prints out and saves their emails, when they contain information. Per back. I don't know.
it's a great question.
It's a great question. I don't know if there's an answer to it.
I think about it a lot, actually, and it always makes me laugh that I'm a historian of the 19th century. But actually, the way I think about it is, for most of human history, we didn't have a great deal of written communication to rely on. And so I wonder if historians of our era are going to have to rely on the same kinds of methods and techniques that maybe anthropologists rely on to learn about if not pre-literate, at least pre-writing societies. The oral, the spoken word used to have much more authority than written word, well into the Middle Ages and beyond, Gutenberg really. And so I've thought a lot about if I'm staying happily in my 19th century, but if one's coming later, are going to have to actually develop very different techniques, because it'll be in a sense going back to an era in which the written word isn't the gold standard of surviving communication.
Let me ask you a question. I'm not on social media. I get an enormous amount of information every day via email, from various news sites that I subscribe to. They concern foreign affairs, labor affairs, all sorts of things. So I collect all this stuff, and I try to save everything that I think might be, this is kind of crazy obsessive, but I try to save everything online. I try to save everything that I can that I think I might like to reread at some point in my life, even though there's not going to be that much left. Or I like to think that maybe somewhere down the road somebody will find this use. But do people who are on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, do they save? Because I often see this stuff, but I'm not participating in it. And I wonder if people save it in any form, any shape or form, or just totally ephemeral.
Bookmark on Twitter, the old people.
Okay, I don't know.
How these will be archived is,
Yeah, but
is,
how
is,
does it
is,
get
is, is a question. And all these traces are.
it's yours.
There's been a lot of photographic evidence of people and video and so forth. So there will be absence of records, but their meaning will be different. And insofar as they're curated in a social media context, they will have a different form. The letter is a genre, and maybe the Facebook page is a genre too. So we'll have to figure out ways of thinking about this. We'll take two more questions.
We're gonna have to
One here
figure
and
out how to
then-
circumvent increasing censorship too.
Yeah, so please.
So I was originally going to ask that question, but so much of what you've been talking about today reflects my personal experience. So I'm one of these immigrants from the 1990s. I know Brendan from home. And when I came over here first, I started writing. I've written those in little letters, right? I still have some letters from, I guess, the late 90s. Then we went to email. Then we went to phone calls and then WhatsApp and all this sort of stuff. So I really wonder what would happen. But what I hear a little bit of what you're saying, which is super important to me, is like, I'm educational immigrant. I came here, I'm not in exile, right? But there's also, how can I say, I was trying to get away from the valley of the squinting windows and all my aunties telling me what to do and who was like this, that, and the other. There was a reason I wanted to leave Ireland and come here. And now everything you say about, the complexity about going back. I can't go back and tell people I can't really criticize. I can ask questions about the political situation. Not you, Brendan, right? But my cousins, right? You can't go back and criticize, and you can't go back and be a failure. You can't go back and say, oh, I live in a cardboard box under a bridge, right? No way, right? So we do go back and forth a lot, but I think there's new complications. So I'm just wondering if to sort of think of that in terms of the letters, do you see like differences in people writing to different people or different audiences and a sort of a critique of the society they left? And so I wouldn't say to my dad, your sisters were driving me crazy with their judginess, right? But they were, and that's not the only reason to leave your town, right? But is that nuance there back in the 19th century? Because it seems to be that you're sort of implying it was in these letters.
I think very, very, very definitely. Again, I mentioned that I had just finished transcribing a very, very long journal. And the immigrant, Patrick Glennon, who wrote this journal, he not only provided a kind of day-by-day description of what he did, the titles, the subjects of the sermons he heard at Mass, etc., but he also transcribed, made copies, transcriptions of all the letters he sent home, and many, at least summaries of all the letters that he received from home. And so you get this, and you do see these differences. He'll say one thing to one sibling that he won't send to another. He'll complain about that sibling that he doesn't write to and the ones that he does. For some odd reason, until his father dies, he never writes to his mother, rarely ever writes to his mother. All the letters are to his father, even though he complains bitterly his father never replies, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, you definitely do see all that. And the notion of what you said, you said something like that really triggered that you can't go back.
Yeah, you can't go back.
Yeah,
You can't, you have to, my experience has been you cannot go back. I mean, even 6 months after leaving, you can't go back. The space you leave fills up and you have to take on a different identity. So I was struck when you said this sort of mid-Atlantic identity, hybrid. I embraced that ages ago. So my husband's American, my kids were born here. Like, great, I'm not entirely Irish, I'm not entirely American, something right there over the, the Atlantic. And I'm fine with that. I feel like I have homes in both places, right? But I know that that's a big struggle for a lot of people.
But you can't go back to a place in time as part of it.
Right.
You remember the Ireland of the 1980s, 1990s. None of us can go back to that Ireland.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Even those who never left the place. Your point is well taken.
We'll take 2 more questions, yourself and yourself here. So you first, yeah.
I'm just thinking about this database. It seems like such an amazing resource, almost just for the ease of having all these primary sources just immediately there. But I also am thinking about, with thousands of sources, the process that it takes to actually transcribe every single one of those to seek out the people. And I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that process of amassing this collection and being in someone's mind, kind of repeating their words over maybe an hour or even a couple of days with something like a journal. Do you think that you approach these works in a different way, whether they stick with you more for having transcribed them than if someone had maybe just dropped the massive pile on your desk? Do you think there's anything in that process that you take into your writing and your analysis?
I don't think there's any question that you do. Yeah, I mean, when you're working on that stuff, the phrases that you read, they just go over and over and over again. And some of them I still remember. I came across, when I told you I was looking at my book for the first time in 6 months. And there was this one woman, she's in Kilkenny, Callan, I think, County South Kilkenny. And it's the tail end of the family. And she's writing to her son who somehow escaped the family. He's in Providence, Rhode Island. She writes, I don't know if I can Never I thought it would come my turn to beg no more. It's an incredibly eloquent phrase. Never I thought it would come my turn to beg no more. It's completely ungrammatical, but oh my God, it's so powerful. And it just, made a tremendous impact on me. But I mean, you have the same thing with thousands of letters, but yeah, just transcribing them all. And a lot of them are extraordinarily difficult. Patricia, my wife, is able to read letters that I cannot, because she learned how to read in a particular, when she was a child, she learned how to read in a particular way. I can read letters that she cannot read, because I was trained to read as a child in a totally different way. So it's a great combination. If letters are, written in a very, very flowery hand, whatever, I can't make any sense out of them. It's like diving into a swamp. Patricia can read them bang, 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 bang. Whereas I can read the letters written by people who are semi-literate, who can barely write at all. So, I mean, yeah, you get really, really into this stuff.
That's part of the close reading that we're talking about. It's part of that technique. Is actually transcribing is the initial process in the close reading.
Do you find reading out loud sometimes to be very, I find reading it out loud to do two things. One, to often be very moving, but on a very practical sense. I find it easier to figure out what they're saying if I read it out loud and hear it. Sometimes, particularly if it's a somewhat creative speller, reading out loud is a piece of that
A
process.
deficiency I have, which something like Brenda and my wife, is to be able to read it and understand it in the accent that would have been going through their heads when they wrote it, which is totally different from my effort to try to read it in standard Phoenix, Arizona English, which is, where I grew up. But one other thing about what you said, the digital base and everything is wonderful. I'm very grateful, and yet I would not give up for $1 million the experience of actually going to Ireland, actually seeing and handling these letters for the first time, going through that process. I mean, that's something that, people who use the database, they won't have the same intimate experience. I mean, it can't be helped, but it can't possibly be quite the same.
No, but just in terms of the last two questions about digital communication and telephones and so forth. One argument has been of late that the current enthusiasm of the last decade or so for memoir is a response to the decline of the more labor-intensive act of writing letters. That has gone away out of people's lives. Some people have argued that it's in that context that people's need to communicate has found expression in this case for memoir. Whether I agree with that or not, I don't.
I can see it. I was wondering about that earlier.
Final question here, please.
You've largely commented on my question, but since I've got the floor. There's a lot of interest and speculation about how such a small population on an island can produce so many literary geniuses. There's been a lot of speculation about that the Irish have taken the English language and made it its own and took an oral tradition, and for the first time, sort of almost a lot of its writing is a transcription almost of oral tradition. You must have, this is a kind of unique opportunity, I would think, to sort of see that firsthand. Do you see that spark, even among semi-literate, et cetera, but do you see that particularly Irish sort of folklorist, sort of common dramatic genius coming out in these letters, or is anybody looking at this from a linguistic point of view? I'm not sure if I'm making that question clear.
All I can tell you is that for years, I had a colleague who helped me with my research a lot. And he had learned the Irish language at Harvard University in their Celtic Studies program. And then he went to West Kerry and immersed himself in the Munster dialect of Irish. And he would read the letters written in English, and he would get so much more out of them than I would, because he would be able to see all these nuances sounds too trivial, but he would be able to see all these influences that, were, that I was blind to. But yeah, no, I think you're right. I'm not probably smart enough to ever really grasp it.
See huge potential in that. It's also part of the storytelling and the resources. I mean, for script writers, for playwrights, for short story writers, for novelists, there is an enormous amount of material here. So, and that doesn't quite speak to your point, but I think there's richness there. And you find that even with people, some people who are remarkably well able to express themselves, and others who express themselves very simply, but it has it's a powerful impact. So it is there. And, by way of conclusion, I thought I would just quote two letters, if I may, and to thank above all our panel and of course Colleen for inviting us and to hosting us today. A brief one, 1898. This is Thomas Clinton writing from Brooklyn, New York. He says, "I be over in New York nearly every day on business. I be in Pat Parsley's very often. I seen Margaret Parsley a few Sundays ago and Ellen Gillick and Miss Higgins. We had a fine time of it. Sung some fine old Irish songs." This is from 1837. This is William Smith writing from Philadelphia to Robert Smith in White Crag, County Antrim. "Dear Robert, you wish to come to this country and say that your mother thinks you too young. But if you want to come, you are old enough. The sooner you come, the better. You're not coming to strangers if you were coming to a strange country. You will come to the best home you ever had. And if you are coming, I wish you to come in the first vessel that will sail from Londonderry, as I have paid your passage and sent you £2 for pocket money. Bring some oatmeal and 1 Irish cheese. Do not neglect to come as soon as you can on receipt of this, as I have a situation for you." Thank you very much.
Thanks very much from our side to our panelists, to Dan for moderating, Kerby. I was very impressed that at any time that anyone mentioned the letter during this conversation, Kerby was nodding along, saying, I remember that exact letter. Patricia, you probably remember transcribing that exact letter. Also to Brendan and to Chandra. Chandra, I loved your phrase that you used several times, mucking about. Because I spent some time mucking about in these letters a couple of weeks ago as well. I read, I wouldn't say I read all of Emigrants and Exiles when I was an undergraduate. I don't think I did the whole thing. But it stuck with me very much. And it was a sort of a defining part of my classes on Irish American history. And it's been a pleasure to read those primary sources and to read them now, much later than I was as an undergraduate, as an English professor. And it brought me to a similar conclusion that Chandra had. Chandra, I think, explained it better than I did, which was she spoke about how the letters somehow, and how people's lives somehow exist between the enormous and the everyday. But this, I'm teaching Ulysses right now, and it makes me think of this technique, this modernist technique called parataxis. When we put things beside each other without giving them an order. And so when you think about, like, so yes, there's a civil war, but there's also bad weather, and there's whatever, and the Blue Sox, right? So you think about the way that the letters create a world in which there's no subordination of power in some ways. And all of these things are part of the everyday life of everyone's existence. It's also great to see this resource being used already, the way that Chandra was talking about using it for your work on soldiering, but also being reinvigorated by what Brendan, when you held up that short book, the first one that you held up, which is basically sort of excerpts and taking out a particular group of stories and repackaging these letters that have been, that were probably transcribed at this point 40 years ago, and making a new story out of them. So all that to say, from our side here at Georgetown, this has been a really, really invigorating conversation and an invitation into the letters. And also thank you to the audience, because you have also ensured that this is not just a conversation about the content of the letters, but it has been just as much about the genre and the form, and about the archiving practices, and about the archiving, and about the possibilities of this collection, which I think is the right kind of conversation to have. And it's a conversation that allows us all to engage in the letters in our own ways. So all of that to say, please join us for some snacks in the back. We thought it was a little bit early for alcohol, but I'm regretting that decision. So but please do join us for some snacks, because otherwise these hordes of people, I've never been in this building before. Hordes of people walking by, they'll come in and eat them, which they are welcome to afterwards. So please, I'm sure our panelists will be happy to continue to chat. And so I'm sure you have more questions as well. So thank you, everybody.
Transcribing.
Okay.
You still
I just
transcribing?
missed the meeting on Thursday.